What should you know about having sex with someone who is uncircumcised? By the way, I'm Dr. Sonya Maya, a psychologist and ASEX certified sex therapist. I make weekly videos about sex, psychology, and relationships. So if you like that, hit that like, hit that subscribe, turn on bell notifications. So something I've noticed is when I talk about circumcision or foreskin or anything along those lines, people get quite heated. So today I'm going to focus on 3 things that people don't realize when it comes to this conversation around foreskin. And this is not about whether you should or shouldn't have sex with someone with a foreskin or whether it's good or bad. It's more about giving you accurate evidence-based information about it so you can make that decision for yourself. So point number 1. It can change pleasure in some ways. It can change the mechanics of sexual stimulation as in a way that a lot of people actually find easier. Let me explain. So if you've had sex with somebody with a foreskin, you probably know what I mean, but the skin itself can actually change the experience in ways that some can argue makes it a little bit easier. For example, let's say you are giving oral sex to somebody. If they have that extra skin there, it's more movable skin, for lack of a better term, and can create this natural kind of glide that you may not experience if you're giving pleasure to somebody that has it removed, for example. So instead of there being this direct friction, there's an additional layer that adds more pressure and movement, and some may even say a bit of like a lubrication. Does that make sense? I think it's more so a natural glide. It allows for more variation in pressure and movement. So yeah, you might find it easier if somebody has a foreskin to provide pleasure in a way that you might not be able to do with someone that doesn't have one. However, the communication matters. So what feels good for each individual person does vary, and it feels good depending on anatomy and personal preference. And if you are a man or a peen owner who has a foreskin, you probably know what I'm talking about, you know? And it's interesting. I'm actually going to get into the history of foreskin, some dark history, after I go through the 3 points that I want to get through regarding how having a foreskin can actually change masturbation in a lot of ways that decreases friction, and there's an ironic aspect of it, but I'll get into that in a moment. Point number 2 is hygiene. I would say probably one of the most prevalent myths I hear about when it comes to uncircumcised men and peen owners is that it's somehow inherently unhygienic, and this is not true. Yes, there does require more of a thorough hygiene protocol, if that makes sense. Basic hygiene is what matters, and you want to have to make sure that you're retracting and cleaning regularly. I've talked about this before, and I'll say it again, even though it's not the funnest thing to say out loud, but if you do not clean your foreskin properly, it can develop something called smegma. And yeah, so it's one of those words where you're just like, it probably sounds like what it smells like. I don't know. We don't have to get into that, but just make sure you're cleaning it. And it's not complicated, you know? People that are taught how to do this properly and do it regularly, they have just as hygienic foreskins and peens as people that are circumcised. So you could definitely get that one out of your head. I've also heard some myths around people being more likely to have STIs if they have a foreskin, which is definitely not true. In many parts of Europe, where I'm going to actually today, a Paris and Instagram, where the majority of men are uncircumcised, you actually don't see higher rates of STIs compared to the US. So like I've said, the idea that having foreskin is unsafe or dirty, it actually doesn't hold up when you look at the evidence. It seems to be one of those myths that unfortunately would just make people feel ashamed, even though it's not even true. Kind of like, you know, a vajayjay being loose from a lot of sex. This fact, in terms of like just make sure to clean your foreskin, reminds me of the myth I'm debunking regularly about vajayjays, where you actually don't need to clean the inside of the vajayjay. However, I find that some doctors and urologists and other sexperts, when they say don't clean the vajayjay, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the vajayjay and the vulva are different things. This is off topic, but let me just get it out now. The vulva is the external part of the genitalia, which you do want to clean with water. But in terms of the vagina itself, the inside part, you don't need to clean it. It's going to clean itself. However, just like a foreskin, you want to clean the flaps of the vajayjay, of the vulva. See, I just did it right there. It's been like ingrained in our brains that like vulva and vagina are the same thing, and they're just not. Point number 3 I want to discuss is the fact that having sex with someone with a foreskin, when I say sex, I'm talking about penetrative sex with a peen owner and a vagina owner, it can change the experience of penetration. And the reason that is because the way the skin moves. And I've heard people talk about this from the UK, where women or vulva owners are more likely to have sex with foreskins more often for obvious reasons, like I stated earlier. And it does change the experience. The way the skin moves, it could be a different sensation. And some people describe it as more smoother or like a gliding sensation or a subtle variation in texture or movement. I've heard people refer to it as like a ribbed sensation, where like sometimes some condoms will try to have like a rib like thing on the condom so that it replicates the feeling of having sex with an uncircumcised penis, which I find interesting. And that was something that I learned a while ago, but I'd never thought of. And one thing I'll note that I've talked about before is that even when you're uncircumcised, for the most part, when you have an erection as a man or a peen owner, you honestly can't really tell with a lot of penises that they're uncircumcised, because the blood flow to the peen, it almost looks like it's circumcised. Whereas like when someone's flaccid, it's more obvious, but of course it varies. There may be some people that are uncircumcised that have a lot more skin. I think it really depends on the situation, but for a lot of people that have their foreskin, they have this perspective of like, I would never want it removed. And I know there's a lot of like cultural stigma around it because there's like religious practices for reasons of circumcision. I could see why people would feel that way or feel heated because it can be very polarizing, but I'm just here to give you the facts in terms of the hygiene and the sensation differences. Now let's get into some of the history when it comes to circumcision, which kind of helps you understand why there's so much stigma around the topic. So let me start with John Harvey Kellogg. Yes, that Kellogg's cornflakes guy. If we're looking back at the 1800s, we'll see that Kellogg was a physician who had extremely strong anti-masturbation myths. So Kellogg and the guy who created s'mores, graham crackers, Graham. There's a guy named Graham and there's a guy named Kellogg. Two different guys, both very anti-masturbation back in the 1800s. And so basically Kellogg promoted circumcision as a way to discourage masturbation, recommending that it's done without anesthesia, and then it would act as a deterrent. Also, he did spread extremely harmful information about discouraging women, of course, to masturbate as well, even encouraged people to remove their clitoris or put a substance like carbolic acid to decrease sexual pleasure. In terms of like the graham crackers and the Kellogg's cornflakes, the idea behind that, which doesn't make sense to me, is that, oh, if people eat bland food, then they're less likely to be horny. Therefore, here's some bland ass cornflakes and bland ass graham crackers. People are less likely to masturbate. That doesn't make any sense at all. This was the logic that they were spreading in their anti-masturbation posts and books and whatever. Of course, it's important to acknowledge that these ideas were not rooted in actual science. They were rooted in moral beliefs that were anti-sexuality and pleasure. What's interesting about this, I'm going to try to explain this the best that I can, is I've actually heard men, clients, individuals out there, right, say, and these are circumcised men, so they don't have a foreskin, say that they actually prefer the more friction, not having the skin there. They like to do something called dry masturbation, where it's like maybe they will masturbate without lube or anything, because there's something about the pain and that intense friction that somewhat becomes eroticized by sensation-seeking patterns in a similar way to how you would eroticize something like humiliation, right? And these are not unhealthy things by any means, unless you are hurting yourself, of course, right? But I just find it ironic that Kellogg promoted circumcision so that people wouldn't masturbate, and then people who are circumcised and maybe and they're shamed for feeling that way, like let's say they have a religious upbringing, they may be more likely to do it in the way that's painful anyway. Yeah, wow, mind-blowing. Overall, when we see cultures that try to suppress the natural desires we have as humans, it typically makes us want to fantasize more about it, and we're more likely to be interested in kinky things or things that may actually cause more sensation but could cause harm. But all of that to say, men who have a foreskin, they may be able to masturbate easier without lube, for example, which, you know, I still recommend using lube anyway, you know, keep everything nice and wet and healthy, and, you know, you're not hurting yourself. When I talk about like, people ask, when they ask me like, am I masturbating too much? I'm always interested in like, what is your relationship with it? First of all, why do you think it's too much? And like, are you hurting yourself? Because maybe we could talk about other ways that aren't going to be harmful, right? But I just find that interesting, where it's like people have different experiences when they have the extra skin there in a way that might actually make it healthier. So it's not like us to say that, you know, penises with foreskin are better than ones without. It's just an interesting aspect to think about, right? Like the different masturbation experiences and how that could actually increase somebody's ability to masturbate in a way that may hurt themselves if they are, participating in sensation seeking in a way that might be harmful to their bodies. If that's something that you relate to, I strongly suggest talking to a licensed therapist, maybe a sex therapist. You can find it through the ASECT website in order to find an ASECT certified sex therapist, because I am very pro masturbation. It's very healthy. However, of course, with anything in life, you might want to moderate it depending on how it's impacting your lifestyle. However, the way that you're doing it matters too. But overall, this is not about me telling you what you should prefer. I mean, oftentimes when you're an adult, you either have a foreskin or you don't. I mean, there are some people that get it removed in adulthood for either medical reasons or maybe it's cosmetic. That's your choice, your body, your choice. I just think it's really important to challenge misinformation. And when it comes to foreskin and circumcision, these topics are very misunderstood. And so it's important for us to understand how our bodies work, make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, and make decisions that align with our comfort and our values, especially if it comes to, a lot of this video is speaking to people that have sex or playful relationships with people that have a foreskin. These are all things that you can keep in mind that might be helpful to, to be more comfortable and confident in those experiences. I am going to be making a video soon on specific tips on how to give oral to somebody that has a foreskin, because I did make a video pretty recently about how to give a BJ. I also made a video on how to go down on a woman. So very inclusive here with tacos and burritos, peens and vajayjays, right? And I hope this was helpful for you, because the more that we rely on blanket statements and myths, we're not making informed choices that are good for our bodies and minds. Everyone, please make pleasurable decisions and decisions. And don't forget to hit that like and then subscribe and turn on those bell notifications. And I'll see you next week.